Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. This subject is titled American Literature. When we were doing the initial lectures, I told you that I was going to break up this module into different parts so that we cover all the known genres of literature. We started off with an essay by Emerson, and this essay on self-reliance was followed by the short story Bartleby the Scrivener. This is a story of Wall Street, and in this story Melville has told us about a scribe or a clerk who is different from other clerks. If I were just to recap what we did in the last couple of lectures, this is a story in which Melville is telling us about the duties of clerks and how each clerk or each scribe or scrivener had to copy documents that had been made. Now, in this story, the narrator is a lawyer, and as such, all documents that need to be copied or all documents that are being discussed here are legal documents. And you all know how difficult the language of a legal document is. Very hard for us to understand unless we have some understanding of legal language. So Bartleby is one of three scriveners in the narrator's office. The other two are nicknamed Turkey and Nippers, and the reason why Melville nicknames them is because of their temperament. Turkey is the one who's all right, working fantastically until 12 noon, and after that, when he has his lunch or dinner, his temperament becomes very volatile, and he gets angry very quickly. He shouts and he bangs things down, whereas Nippers, who is young compared to Turkey's 60-ish age group, Nippers is very difficult to bear in the mornings, but after noon he is very calm and placid, and there is none of the fire in his temperament that you see at that time in that of Turkey. So these two sort of balance them out. Now, when the narrator gets an additional assignment and is given an additional responsibility of master in chancery, he feels the need to have another clerk because there's more work coming in. There's also more money coming in, and he can afford to have another clerk. So he advertises and he gets Bartleby. Now, Bartleby works fantastically for the first few days. But after that, the narrator notices that when he is asked to examine copies that he has made or to do some other trivial work, he refuses. Now, his refusal comes in such a way that it is not rude. He doesn't say, "I will not do it." He doesn't say, "I can't do it." But his stock phrase is, "I would prefer not to." Now, the choice of words is formal and at the same time very polite. He doesn't say outright that he will not do it, but he gives his preference. The first couple of times the narrator is very confused, and because it's very difficult for him to accept it. You know, the work of a clerk is such that he is at the beck and call of the employer, and as such clerks don't normally refuse to do anything. Nippers and Turkey are doing it all the time. If The narrator wants them to get something, they will do it. If he wants them to examine documents, examine copies, they will do it. But Bartleby is a different person altogether. The reason why the narrator puts up with him or tolerates him is because, for one, Bartleby looks very sedate, very polite, very respectable and respectful, and yet he's not rude, he's not cold. He just does his work in his own way, and he will only do what he thinks are the duties of a clerk or what falls into the category of his job description, and he will not do anything else. So the first time that Bartleby says, I would prefer not to examine copies, the narrator gets turkey and nippers and the office boy Ginger Nut to do it. And then he starts to observe Bartleby, and he realizes that Bartleby never goes out anywhere. It's not only that, but he doesn't seem to eat anything apart from a few ginger cakes which the office boy brings for him. So he appears to have little or no money. He appears to have no friends or no family, because the narrator sees him in office early morning when he turns up, and he sees him when he leaves in the evening. So Bartleby is always in the office. He never goes out. Nobody comes to see him. Nobody comes to meet him. Whereas you have people coming to meet, let's say, Turkey and Nippers. But nobody comes to meet Bartleby. He doesn't go out anywhere. And that sort of further adds to the confusion as far as the narrator is concerned. Now, the point at which we broke off in the previous lesson was where the narrator had decided that he would not give any extra work to Bartleby, because the time that Bartleby did not spend in his work, he would just stand absolutely still behind the screen. There's the screen dividing Bartleby's area from that of his employers. And when he was just standing there behind the screen, you couldn't communicate with him, you couldn't talk to him. So this is the situation in which the narrator finds himself. Let us now see what Herman Melville has for us today in this story that was written in 1853. So now and then, in the eagerness of dispatching passing business, I would inadvertently summon Bartleby in a short, rapid tone to do something. So even though the narrator tells himself that he shouldn't give extra work to Bartleby because he doesn't like doing it, yet in spite of that, because he's there the whole day, and because there's so many things that happen in offices that you get people to do it without thinking whether it falls within their job description or not. So without thinking, he would call out to Bartleby, and Bartleby would either not respond, or he would just say, I would prefer not to. Now, what you need to understand, dear students, is that throughout it all, Bartleby is very polite. He's not, he is in no mood, or when he does not want to do anything, he is never rude. He never uses a tone of voice or words that would convey his anger. All that he says is, I would prefer not to. So very polite, but very firm. So whenever he called out to Bartleby, this is the response that he would get. Now what happened is that each time that Bartleby said, I prefer not to, or I would prefer not to, the narrator got more and more confused. He says, according to the custom of most legal gentlemen occupying themselves in densely populated low buildings, there were several keys to my door. So one was kept by a woman residing in the attic, and of course she was the one who cleaned up the office. The second key Turkey had so that they could come to office whenever they turned up. And the third, the narrator kept himself. Now there were 4 keys. He didn't know who had the 4th key. And the incident that he's referring to happened one Sunday morning when he had gone to church, and on his way back from church he just thought that he would walk around his office or his chambers as they were called. Since he had his key with him, there was no problem in getting into the office. But when he tried to open up the office door, he found out that something had been inserted on the other side. Now he was worried, he was confused, because it was a Sunday morning, it was a holiday, and nobody should have been in the office. There should have been nothing inserted from the other side. And then shortly after he had called out, a key was turned, and what he saw was Bartleby's face, and Bartleby was holding the door open. And what does he come up with? He says that I prefer not to admit you at present, because he was deeply engaged. Now this is Sunday morning in an office, holiday, early morning. The narrator comes to his office, finds Bartleby there. And not only is Bartleby occupying the office, but he will not let the narrator into the office. And he says instead that if you walk around the block 2 or 3 times and then come in, I shall be free. So the narrator in his confusion does exactly that. He goes out because he's so surprised to find Bartleby there. He's not only surprised, but he's confused also. And so from his own office, he goes back as if, he had been a criminal, as if he had been a thief who had been caught out. As Melville says, I slunk away from my own door and did as desired. So he goes out of the office building, walks around the block 2 or 3 times, and then when he comes back to the office, he finds that the office door is locked. But when he inserts his key, the door opens. It's not like the first time when he comes and he finds that something has been inserted on the other side. So what Bartleby had done was, in order to make sure that nobody entered, he had put his own key in the lock. Now, you can open a door that is locked on the outside, from the outside, or a door that's locked from the inside, from the outside. But if there is a key on the inside, then you can't open the door. Then your key will not turn. You get the door lock will only take 1 key at a time. So when he comes up the second time after walking around the block, he finds that Bartleby has gone. And although he's upset by the thought of what Bartleby was doing in his office, he doesn't have an answer to that. And what comes to his mind is whether there's anything fishy, whether Bartleby is some kind of a criminal, who's engaged in criminal activities, and that is why he's using the narrator's office. He could not think that Bartleby was doing something immoral, because Bartleby's was the kind of personality that just would not admit to anything of that kind. You couldn't imagine Bartleby, let's say, doing anything immoral. So the first thought that comes to his mind is whether Bartleby was doing anything immoral, and then he says, no, this is not possible. Bartleby has the kind of personality which does not even allow you to think that he can do something immoral. Nevertheless, his mind is not pacified. He's confused. He's upset, and he enters into the office, and because he's surprised to see Bartleby there on a Sunday morning, he sort of makes a reconnaissance of the office, and he finds out that Bartleby has not only been staying in the office, but he's been sleeping there, he's been dressing up there, and he's being eaten. He's being eating there, and all this without plate, mirror, or bed. Now, when you start to dress up, you need a mirror in front of you, and I know some of you spend a long time in front of the mirror. And when you eat anything, you need a plate. If you want to sleep, you need a bed. Now, the office had neither a mirror nor a plate or a bed. And yet, when he examined the office, he found out that Bartleby had been sleeping there. Now, how did he come to this conclusion? There was an old sofa in the office, and it's this sofa that he appeared to be using as a bed. Then he makes a further investigation, and he finds out that under the desk is a blanket. Now, that's the blanket that Bartleby has been using. Under the empty grate, that is the place where you build fire, there was a blacking box and brush. That is a shoe polish box and a shoe polish brush. On a chair, there was a tin basin, that is a small bowl with soap and a ragged towel. And in a newspaper, a few crumbs of ginger nuts and a morsel of cheese. That is all the evidence that the narrator has to conclude that Bartleby has been living in the office. How long? You don't know. Probably since the day that he first appeared. Now, how did he manage to live in the office without a bed, without proper bedding, without having any other clothes, without having any eating utensils? It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. Yes, thought I, it is evident enough that Bartleby has been making his home here, keeping bachelor's hall all by himself. So he's been living here, but what the narrator realizes is that Bartleby has been living alone. It's not like the first idea that he got, that perhaps Bartleby was doing something immoral here, perhaps keeping a woman in the office. But he doesn't find any evidence of that. But what he does find out is that Bartleby is all alone. He doesn't have a place to go to. He doesn't have any people that he can visit. Nobody visits him. So he appears to be totally friendless. And this is something which really upsets the narrator. So think of it, he says, on a Sunday morning in Wall Street, where you see nobody, you have this man who is all by himself, with no place to go to and with no one to visit him. So what miserable friendlessness. The building too, which of weekdays hums with industry and life, was totally deserted. You know, during the week there were people coming and going, there was work going on, and it was a noisy place, it was a busy place. But on weekends it was totally deserted, it was silent as a graveyard. And yet this is the place where Bartleby lives. So he compares him to a Marius brooding among the ruins of Carthage. He compares him to a Carthaginian invader. But throughout it all, there is that sense of hopelessness for a human being who has no friends, no family, who gets no visitors, who doesn't appear to be eating anything. All that he is seen to be eating is a handful of ginger cakes, and that cannot sustain you for 24 hours. If you remember, Melville had said earlier that during the morning, Ginger Nut, the office boy, would come to Bartleby, get a little money from him in the form of coins, never any notes, and then he would bring back a handful of those ginger cakes. And out of those, 2 would be given to him as payment. So Bartleby did not eat anything, he didn't have any friends to go to, he didn't have any friends or family coming to meet him. Now, if you think that an individual is leading a normal human life, you may not be having visitors in the office, but then you have visitors elsewhere, or you go out somewhere. But Bartleby doesn't appear to be going out anywhere. When everyone leaves in the evening, he's still there. And it's only on this Sunday morning that the narrator discovers that the reason why they find Bartleby always in the office is because he lives in the office. That's where he eats, that's where he sleeps, that's where he dresses. So for the first time in his life, a feeling of overpowering, stinging melancholy seizes the narrator. So he's surprised to see that, this is a place where Bartleby is living, and how miserable his existence must be to have no friends, no family to turn to, and yet, his ancestors also were descendants of Adam. The narrator goes on to say, I remember the bright silks and sparkling faces I had seen that day in gala trim, swan-like sailing down the Mississippi of Broadway. So he compares Broadway to the Mississippi River, which is very wide, and where you have barges and shallow-bottomed boats always traveling. So he says, I had seen people dressed up in bright clothes and wearing a festive air, and yet I come to the office where Bartleby is living all alone. He doesn't go out, and nobody comes to see him. He, in the middle of all this finery, in the middle of all this life, Bartleby is alone, and he has no one. So his life, the narrator says, is a pallid life. It doesn't have any color in it, and he thinks that the world is gay, the world is happy, and yet when you look at such people, you realize that perhaps the world is not always happy. So these thoughts take him on to other thoughts, and he starts feeling further confused, and not just further confused, but also he starts to feel slightly afraid. He says, "The scrivener's pale form appeared to me laid out among uncaring strangers in his shivering winding sheet." So his imagination runs wild, and he thinks of Bartleby dead, and not just Bartleby dead, but Bartleby dead and alone, dead and friendless. So that's two deaths combined. Suddenly he sees Bartleby's desk, which is closed, but in which there is a key, and he has an overpowering curiosity to see what Bartleby's desk contains, because while Bartleby is there, the narrator or his employer does not have the courage to go and ask him to show what he has in his desk. So now that he sees Bartleby's desk, it comes to his mind that he should know what's going on. He should find out, and if it means asking him questions, well, you know, he's the employer, so he can do that. There is no problem with it. Now, when he opens up his desk, he sees everything is methodically arranged. The pigeonholes were deep, you know, in which they keep sort of documents. And removing the files of documents, I groped into their recesses. So those pigeonholes that were made on the top of the desk, he starts to grope for them on the other side. Presently, I felt something there and dragged it out. So he starts looking around in his desk without disturbing things, and he finds at the back of the desk, he finds an old bandana handkerchief, which is sort of tied up and knotted. And when he opens it up, he sees that there is money in it. Now, it's not just that Bartleby has no friends or no family. Bartleby has no home. There is no place for Bartleby to go to. There is no place where people can come and see Bartleby. Since he's living here, this is the place where he has been keeping the money that he earns also. And now when the narrator starts to recall the personality of Bartleby, he thinks of his many eccentricities. I remember that he never spoke but to answer, so he doesn't volunteer any information. Though at intervals he had considerable time to himself, yet I had never seen him reading, so he doesn't even read, not even a newspaper. And that at intervals he would stand looking out at his pale window behind the screen. And he looked at what? A lawn? A beautiful garden? Traffic? No. He looks out at the dead brick wall. Remember, in the beginning, Melville had told us that one side of his office there was a window, but right opposite the window was a plain brick wall of another building where there was no window. So all that this window looked out at was a brick wall. It wasn't a scene that was worth seeing, and yet he would see Bartleby standing there during the daytime. So just like that, you know, all these ideas and all these thoughts come to his mind, and reinforce the sense of hopelessness that the writer and the narrator feel at thinking of the kind of life that Bartleby the Scrivener appears to be leading. He has a very pale face, so it's taken for granted that he never drinks beer, because beer makes your face go all red. And he never went anywhere in particular. He had not even told them who he was or where he had come from or whether he had any relatives in the world. And in spite of the fact that he was thin and pale, he never complained of bad health. So these are some of the points that that keep on bothering the writer and the narrator. And then he goes on to say that more than everything else, I remembered a certain unconscious air of pallid haughtiness or an austere reserve about him, which had positively awed me into my tame compliance with his eccentricities. When I had feared to ask him to do the slightest incidental thing for me, even though I might know from his long continued motionless that behind the screen he must be standing, he still would not do it. He just would say, I prefer not to. So when he was not working, he would just be standing there looking at the dead brick wall. He didn't go out, he had nobody coming in. These are the two things that he appears to be doing, working or standing. And then when he stands absolutely silently and straight. So thinking about all these things and, trying to think of other things that he remembers about Bartleby, confuses the writer and the narrator. His primary emotions are those of pure melancholy and sincerest pity. In proportion to the forlornness of Bartleby, it grew and grew in the writer's imagination. And as he continued to think about it, his pity sort of metamorphosed into resentfulness. He started to feel angry at Bartleby for not having visitors, for not going out anywhere. So the more that he thinks about Bartleby, the more upset he becomes. When he looks at his desk and he finds that Bartleby has been making his home in the office, it gives rise to other thoughts. And when he thinks that he doesn't eat anything, he doesn't drink anything, he doesn't appear to go out anywhere, he doesn't appear to have a family or friends, the narrator starts to think that there is something wrong with Bartleby, as he says that he had some form of an incurable disorder, and he feels that he could give something to his body, but his body did not pain him. It was his soul that suffered, and his soul I could not reach. So the narrator is very sympathetic to Bartleby, and he wants to help him out, but he does not understand how he should help Bartleby out. So long does he think about this that he ends up not going to the church because he feels that here is somebody who is employed by him and whose problems he is not able to solve. So how can he go to church, face God, when he cannot help his fellow man, when he cannot help people who are working under him? So he feels that it would be sort of cheating in a way if he were to go to church. And while he's thinking about these things, he decides that he's going to ask Bartleby what is wrong, and he's going to try to help him as far as it is possible for him to. And then he says that, I'm going to admit that I have done wrong, and I'm going to calculate the amount of money I owe him, and I'll give him something extra. I'll give him $20 extra because I'm not giving him notice. And I'll say, well, goodbye because I don't think that we can get along. And he also thinks that he would like to know where Bartleby comes from, and he will advise Bartleby, go back to your native village, and he would of course give him some form of travelling allowance, and if he ever needed a reference letter he would provide that also. Okay, so Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Sunday night comes to an end. Monday morning he calls out to Bartleby and there's no answer. He calls out again and he says, Bartleby, come here. I'm not going to ask you to do anything you would prefer not to do. I simply wish to speak to you. So when Bartleby appears, the narrator asks him where he was born, and Bartleby's answer is, I would prefer not to tell anything. And when the narrator says, will you tell me anything about yourself? Bartleby's answer is, I would prefer not to. So then the narrator asks him what objection he has to him. You know, when he is so friendly, why does Bartleby not respond in the same friendly manner? But Bartleby, of course, does not say anything. He doesn't even look at him. And this is something that sort of upsets the writer and the narrator. And he says, what is your answer? You know, I'm telling you that I'm friendly, I'm willing to be friends, but you will not confide in me, you will not tell me anything about yourself. And Bartleby's answer is, at present, I prefer to give no answer. Saying this, he goes back behind the screen. And of course, the screen by now, the screened area, the narrator is referring to as his hermitage, because Bartleby appears to be like a hermit. He just stays in that corner. He doesn't come out. He doesn't go out anywhere. Nobody comes to see him. So he's like a hermit. And the narrator says that, you know, it was rather weak in me, I confess, but his manner on this occasion nettled me. Not only did there seem to lurk in it a certain calm disdain, but his perverseness seemed ungrateful. So now he thinks that he's being ungrateful because, you know, I have always been good to him. I give him his salary on time, and yes, look at him. He will not answer me, he will not tell me where he comes from, he will not tell me who his parents are. I am prepared to be friendly with him, but he is not willing to do the same. So he decides that he is going to dismiss Bartleby. So when he decides that he is going to talk to Bartleby again and Bartleby does not respond, the narrator goes behind the screen. You know, he takes his chair and he goes behind the screen, sits down and says, okay, never mind about revealing your history, but let me entreat you as a friend to comply as far as may be with the usages of this office. Say now you will help to examine papers tomorrow or next day. In short, say now that in a day or two you will begin to be a little reasonable. Say so, Bartleby. And his answer is, at present I would prefer not to. So the narrator is doing his utmost to ensure that Bartleby stays a part of this office. But in order to have a particular position in the office, Bartleby needs to do some work. Bartleby needs to come across as a person who can communicate and with whom people can communicate. He can't just live all by himself in one corner of the room and think that that is his work. So the narrator tries everything. He even goes to his corner and says, okay, just promise me that in a day or two you will start doing work, the kind of work that others are doing, and I will not say anything. And Bartleby's response is the same. I would prefer not to. At this moment, Nippers approached. And because this was the time when Nippers was having his fit, he catches the last words and he becomes very angry, you know, and he grinds his teeth and he says, "Prefer not. I'd prefer him if I were you, sir. I'd prefer him. I'd give him preferences, the stubborn mule. What is it, sir, that he prefers not to do now?" So Nippers is in one of his bad moods. And he says, "You know, how is it that you tolerate all this rudeness from him? If I were in your place, I would, you know, box his ears for him, and I would beat him up and thrash him, and he would do the work." So, in spite of all that Nippers shouts and screams, Bartleby doesn't move a limb. And the narrator says, "Mr. Nippers, I'd prefer that you would withdraw for the present." And he realizes that somehow lately he has also taken to using the same word, prefer. And he says, "I tremble to think that my contact with the scrivener had already and seriously affected me in a mental way," in that he's starting to use Bartleby's language. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but when you are affected by a person to such an extent that you start using the same type of language or the same manner of speech, that is the time when you start to get worried. So this small incident that happens in his office sort of gives him the idea that Bartleby is not willing to make compromises. He has his own ideas and he's going to stick to those ideas no matter what happens. Now, when this incident is over, Nippers is met by Turkey, and Turkey says, "Yesterday I was thinking about Bartleby here, and I think that if he would but prefer to take a quart of good ale every day, it would do much towards mending him." So Turkey's idea is that drink will cure everything. And he says that the problem with Bartleby is that he does not drink. Now, if he were to drink ale every day, he would be perfectly all right. And he would be able to examine papers and he would be like a normal human being. You know, this is what Turkey thinks is wrong with Bartleby. And while they're having this conversation, remember they are still behind the screen. And Bartleby feels that he is being restricted. So he says, "I would prefer to be left alone here." Now, anyone would think that that's a rather rude way of addressing your boss or your colleagues. But the thing is that Bartleby has thought that this particular corner is very private, and that he can do whatever he wants to there. And now that he sees that his boss is there and he's brought his chair, and then Turkey comes in, there are chances that Nippers and Ginger Nut would also follow. So his space is being restricted, his space is being limited. So he tells Turkey to withdraw. He realizes that nearly all of them have started to use Bartleby's favorite word, and that is prefer. And of course, Nippers and Turkey also pick this up, and Nippers uses it in his speech, and he'll say, do you prefer to give me this paper, or would you prefer red over blue, or whatever. So they pick up this one word, prefer, and they play around with it to see what effect it has. Now, the narrator is getting quite confused, and yet, he doesn't really want to dismiss him, because he thinks that it's going to look bad for his image. Now that he has work with the government might not like it that he's overworking the two clerks that he already has. Okay, so the next day he notices that Bartleby doesn't seem to be doing any work, as if he had decided to do no more writing. And this obviously confuses the narrator, and he says, "Why have you decided to do no more writing?" And Bartleby gives a very strange response. He says, "Do you not see the reason for yourself?" Now, this is a question that gives rise to a whole host of other questions. The narrator looks at him, but sees that his eyes are dull and glazed. And at once he thinks that because he has been sitting by this very dim window, his eyesight has been affected. And he decides to have him checked up. So he thinks that his vision has probably been impaired because he's been sitting close to a very sort of dull window, and there's not much sunlight coming in, and there's not very strong light in the office itself. This sort of touches him. And he says, you are very right that you are not writing, and I don't want your eyes to be affected. What you can do is use this time to take some exercise in the open air, thinking that he's being very sympathetic and thinking that he's only concerned about Bartleby's health. This is what the narrator urges him to do. Yet he doesn't do that. He continues to stay inside the building, and he doesn't go anywhere. A few days later, Turkey and Nippers being absent, he called Bartleby because he was in a hurry to complete certain letters, and knowing that Bartleby knew that the other two were not around, he thought that Bartleby would do the work that he gave him. But Bartleby declines. He says that I will not do any of the work. So the lawyer is forced to go himself. He feels upset, but he still goes and does it. And so time passes. Time passed, days went back, but if he tried to communicate with Bartleby, he got no answer, and he stopped doing the copy work. Now, the thing is that when he stops doing copy work, it's all right for a few days, but he can't just sort of be in the office and not do any work, because he's not doing any of the other work also. So when he is asked by his employer whether he has permanently given up copying, he says yes. The narrator is very upset at that, and he says, supposing your eyes get well, will you not copy then? And he says, I have given up copying. So very polite but very firm, and once he gives an answer, he doesn't change it. And so he stayed where he was. He didn't do any of the work. He would not fetch or carry, but he became a fixture in the office. he didn't do anything there. And the thought that came to the employer's mind, to the narrator's mind, is why then should he stay in the office? So Bartleby becomes a sort of burden on the office, because he's occupying space, he's not doing any work, and his very presence makes the narrator very conscious and uneasy. So he makes inquiries about relatives, about friends, anyone who would take Bartleby away to perhaps a place where there was lots of sunshine and lots of air, and where he would get well. But he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe, a bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic. So Melville compares him to the world to the Atlantic Ocean, and he says there was nobody whom Bartleby knew or whom he could call family. So when things come to this point where he says that he has given up copying, the narrator starts to feel that if he has given up copying and he will not do any copy work, and he insists on occupying that place, he insists on using the office as his residence, it's not really justified. So in a very, very polite manner, he calls Bartleby and he tells him that he has 6 days in which to find another place, and at the end of those 6 days, Bartleby would have to leave. He could not afford to have Bartleby in the office, thinking that he is occupying space, he's not doing any work at all. So, it's wrong of him to occupy space that the narrator could use in some other way, bring in another clerk, put him in that position, give him that place, and have him do the work of the government, do the work that had been given to his employer. So he offers him all kinds of help, and he says, if you need money, I can give you money. If you want work, I can recommend people. And when you finally quit me, Bartleby, I shall see that you go not away entirely unprovided. Remember, 6 days from this hour. And at the end of those 6 days, he peeps around the screen and Bartleby is there. So then he becomes angry and he says, the time has come. You must quit this place. I am sorry for you. Here is money. I am giving you more than I owe you, but you must go. And Bartleby's answer is, I would prefer not to. And when the narrator says, you must, Bartleby is silent. Now, I had an unbounded confidence in this man's common honesty. Remember, throughout it all, Melville has been saying that Bartleby was a very honest man, that he could trust him with all his important documents because he would never be dishonest. But he says that, this is where I just put my foot down and I decided that Bartleby had to go. Now we're going to stop here and I'm going to recap what we have done today in this story. The story that is titled Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street, was written by Herman Melville in 1853, and it tells the story of this scribe or this clerk who comes one day in response to an advertisement and then he sort of stays in the office of the lawyer. He's a very good copier, but with the passage of time, what happens is that the narrator realizes that not only does Bartleby say that he's not going to examine documents that he has copied, but in time he even refuses to copy documents, saying that his employer should know the reason why. And when the narrator looks at Bartleby's face, he realizes that his eyes have started to look very dull and glazed. So the narrator thinks that, there's been a problem with Bartleby's eyes, and that he should rest and he should not be given work for a few days. So he doesn't give him work. He gives extra work to turkey and nippers and even ginger nut. But time passed, and Bartleby did not say that he would go back to copying. And when the narrator asks him if he had given up copying altogether, and Bartleby says, yes, I will not copy anymore. Now, during this time, the narrator also realizes, when he visits his office on a Sunday morning, that Bartleby has been making his home in the office. Now, he's very upset at that, because it's a place that is totally friendless. On a holiday morning, there's absolutely no one in the business section of the city, and because this office is in the business section of the city, it's totally deserted. So in the beginning, it makes him feel sympathetic, and he feels that he would like to help Bartleby out. But with the passage of time, he realizes that Bartleby's answer of "I would prefer not to" is repeated ad nauseum. It's repeated so many times over that it starts to annoy him. Of course, it annoys the other clerks in the office. But the trouble comes when it starts to annoy his employer. He tries to give Bartleby an incentive and says, you should go out and take fresh air. But he realizes that Bartleby doesn't want to go out. Bartleby doesn't have anyone coming in. He doesn't appear to be eating anything. So he feels very sympathetic towards him in the beginning, but with the passage of time, he realizes that Bartleby is occupying space in the office. It's space which can be used by another clerk, another scrivener, and yet Bartleby refuses to give up that office. So the part where we sort of concluded the lesson today is the portion where Bartleby's employer gives him 6 days to pack up and leave the office premises. And it does sound a little harsh, but you have to think of it from the employer's point of view. He's being very kind, he's being very accommodating, but Bartleby is not really making an attempt at all. So even when the narrator says that, I want you to leave this office within 6 days, but you must remember that I'm not kicking you out without a penny. I'm going to give you what you have earned, and I'm going to give you money beyond that. And wherever you find a new place, if you need a job, let me know and I'll give you a reference letter. If you need me money, I can send you money, but you have to leave this place. And Bartleby's answer is, I would prefer not to. So he doesn't change his mind, he doesn't change his attitude, and all this is very worrying and very frustrating for the writer who's acting as narrator also in the section that we did today. We're going to stop here for now, And when we meet in the next class, we're going to continue this from the same part. So thank you very much for being patient listeners, and Allah Hafiz.